A big international conference this week on rebuilding Ukraine featured a word salad: building back better, winning the peace, prioritizing people. Each denotes an important means by which the country might rise from the ashes of Russia's predations, replacing fossilized Soviet facilities with new ones up to European standards, reshaping oligarch-influenced agencies as efficient government institutions, creating housing, schools, and jobs to encourage millions of Ukrainian refugees to come home and help rebuild their shattered country. But those ambitious goals were discussed amidst the rumble of a hard reality: the huge obstacles that Ukraine has to overcome to attract the $400 billion to $1 trillion it will need to make itself whole when the guns stop blazing. What has been pledged so far? The EU pumped 30 billion euros into Ukraine in the last year, diverting cash from energy and cohesion funds to respond to the crisis. The United States has delivered more than $20 billion in economic assistance to Ukraine, Mr. Blinken said, as well as $2.1 billion in humanitarian aid. It is also the largest provider of military aid to the Ukrainian military. However, Western funds would take a long time to be sufficient for the reconstruction needs of Kiev as the conflict drags on, and considering inflation, Ukraine's real needs will continue to increase. Will the West have enough money to meet this demand? What are the risks of seizing Russian assets for Ukraine's reconstruction? The EU has a vested interest in helping Ukraine recover. However, experts say that this is a one-size-fits-all approach for the alliance. Specifically, how does this play out? Let's delve into some analysis in today's World Affairs. Convincing countries and investors to blow billions of dollars of aid and investment into a country at war. It's a huge ask, but for a growing number of countries supporting Ukraine looks like a gamble worth taking as Europe tries to stave off a humanitarian and economic disaster on its continent. The price tag is already a cool $411 billion according to the World Bank, United Nations, and European Commission, a figure that will only increase as the war grinds on. The EU pumped 30 billion euros into Ukraine in the last year, diverting cash from the energy and cohesion funds to respond to the crisis. On Tuesday, it pledged a further 50 billion euros in loans and grants, with the UK and the US following suit with a promise of $3 billion and $1.3 billion respectively in financial support. The UK government has also set out a package of support for Ukraine, including $3 billion of new guarantees to unlock World Bank loans and $305 million of bilateral assistance. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said at the conference that the United States would send an additional $1.3 billion in financial assistance to Ukraine to overhaul its energy grid and modernize other critical infrastructure. The World Bank, in conjunction with the government of Ukraine, the European Commission, and the UN, has put the cost of reconstruction and recovery at $411 billion after a year of war. But as top global figures, governments, and private investors flock to London Wednesday for the Ukraine Recovery Conference, signs point to the Western world preparing to open its purse strings to help Ukraine rebuild. On Tuesday, the European Commission unveiled a new multi-year billion-euro project to help with the reconstruction of Ukraine, the first major economic grouping to outline a costed multi-annual funding plan. To help meet that need, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has enlisted BlackRock and JP Morgan to advise on the Ukraine Development Fund, a vehicle that seeks to mobilize capital from private and public sector investors toward rebuilding the Ukrainian economy. The Ukraine Development Fund aims to raise so-called concessionary capital from governments and development banks and then use that to attract private investment. Concessionary capital is provided on more favorable terms and can include debt issued at below market interest rates or equity from investors asking for lower returns. The Ukrainian government has identified 5 industries to which initial investments from the fund will be directed: infrastructure, energy, manufacturing, agriculture, and information technology. For Ukraine, it's vital that the recovery project starts now. Reconstruction is already happening. It's part of our resistance, Alexandra Azakina, Ukraine's Deputy Minister for Communities, Territories and Infrastructure Development, told Politico. People have left Ukraine, but at the same time, millions are staying, working, living here, she said. We need to find ways to provide access to the basic needs of those people. Ukraine needs help, not just on the battlefield, but in terms of private and public investment. Starkly laying out the moral case, President Volodymyr Zelensky stressed the importance of the conference in an address on Monday night, saying Ukraine's economic recovery should demonstrate to the world that freedom is invincible. Speaking to the participants by video link, President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine argued that there was economic opportunity in the ruins of his country. He thanked the donors but pleaded with them to start investing immediately. Speaking in London Wednesday, he added, "At this conference, we must move from vision to agreements and from agreements to real projects." 7 decades after the US-run Marshall Plan helped to rebuild Western Europe after World War II, Europe finds itself at a decisive moment, questioning whether it should give Ukraine the resources and investments it needs to rebuild, even as war rages in the east and south of the country. It's a Herculean task. Adjusted for inflation, the Marshall Plan, a package of loans and grants, provides less than a third of what Ukraine needs. Furthermore, the scale of the challenge keeps shifting. Destruction of the Nova Kakhovka Dam this month unleashed massive environmental as well as infrastructure damage, showing how the needs of Ukraine are changing in real time. People want to bring their life back to normal, go to school, go to work. We cannot deter people from that. It's something that should not be postponed until the post-war period, because it is urgent and it is needed now, Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister Olha Stefanishyna told Politico. Ukraine's needs range from rebuilding the 300-plus bridges that have been destroyed to demining and dealing with the millions of tons of industrial waste generated by Russia's bombardment. But despite the scale of the challenge, the EU is going all in, at least for now. On the eve of the summit, the European Commission unveiled a new plan to help the country run its day-to-day operations and fund Ukraine's reconstruction. Dubbed the Ukraine Facility, it will provide up to 50 billion euros in financial support for Ukraine from 2024 to 2027. 33 billion euros in loans and 17 billion euros in grants, which will be managed via a new special instrument called the Ukraine Reserve. The facility would be financed with grants from EU budget, loans raised on capital markets, and proceeds from frozen Russian assets, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said Wednesday. Additionally, the Commission is also in talks with the European Investment Bank to provide EU budget guarantees to fund another 100 million euros of loans to Ukraine. It's a significant commitment from the EU at a time when its budget is facing many demands from member states, from building its own collective defense capability and irregular migration to bolstering the EU's competitiveness and industrial base. The commitment will provide perspective for our partners in Ukraine, predictability, and it should also incentivize other donors to step up too, said European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in announcing the plan in Brussels on Tuesday. But the EU's motivation is not purely altruistic. Brussels has skin in the game and is vulnerable to any instability in Ukraine. Following the European Council's decision to grant Ukraine and Moldova membership status last year, Ukraine is on track to join the EU. It's therefore in the EU's interest that a country of 40 million that might one day join the bloc is a stable, economically healthy democracy. The EU is also eyeing Ukraine's potential in other ways. European Commission Vice President Maros Sefcovic believes Ukraine, the biggest country by area that lies entirely in Europe, could be a crucial resource for Europe. If you look at critical raw materials, Ukraine has 21 of the 30 materials needed by the EU. It could completely replace Russia's supplies of critical raw materials to Europe, he told Politico. Similarly, Ukraine could act as Europe's energy storage hub. Ukraine has the largest underground storage facilities for gas in Europe, 33 billion cubic meters just at the border of Slovakia. The potential there is enormous, he said. It could be a very important strategic asset for the energy security of the European Union, he added, also name-checking hydrogen as another possible growth area for energy. But challenges remain, least of all the potential for corruption in Ukraine, of which many EU countries remain wary. As a result, the European Commission's package comes with strings attached. Brussels will exercise significant control over how the money is distributed and deployed. Under the Commission's proposal unveiled Tuesday, the Ukrainian government must prepare a Ukraine plan detailing its vision for the country, while meeting EU standards on governance and public administration. Money would be disbursed on quarterly basis, provided conditions are met. Companies and governments are also grappling with the challenge of investing in projects in a country still at war. The new Ukraine Development Fund would not start actually investing money until the war is over. Ukraine has been pushing back against these concerns. Stefanisna points out that most of Ukraine is unoccupied and not in Russia's crosshairs. It's highly unlikely that land aggression will return to this territory. People are already coming back, she says. But in a chilling reminder of Russia's reach, Moscow launched a barrage of drone and missile attacks at Ukraine on Monday night, aiming as far west as Lviv, just 70 kilometers from the Polish border. Looming over the discussion about investment ahead of this week's conference is the issue of insurance, a massive barrier to businesses wanting to invest in the country. Britain, which is also one of Ukraine's largest military suppliers, is leveraging London's status as a global center of finance and insurance to stimulate foreign investment, in part by trying to reduce the risks to investors. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak also unveiled a war risk insurance framework backed by the group of 7 countries, which will help limit potential losses faced by private investors in Ukraine. This is a huge step forward towards helping insurers to underwrite investments into Ukraine, removing one of the biggest barriers and giving investors the confidence they need to act, Sunak said in a speech at the conference. The West hopes much of the eventual rebuilding cost will be borne by private companies, hoping for profits. Yet there is little chance of that without an international effort to provide insurance against the ongoing risk of future Russian missile strikes that could lay waste to half-finished factories and office buildings, and to hopes for Ukraine's revival. Despite initiatives announced in London by British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and other European officials, it remains uncertain how that insurance will be financed in the long term. You don't know how long the war will be there, whether what you invest in will be destroyed the week after, so it's very challenging. Odal Renaud Passol, the president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, told reporters in Brussels recently. One of the conference's main goals was also to put in place guarantees to help mitigate the risk for private companies choosing to invest. Private investors see a tremendous opportunity to invest in Ukraine's post-war future, according to Stefan Weller, JP Morgan's head of debt capital markets for Central and Eastern Europe, the Middle East and Africa. Weller, who traveled to Kiev in February, told CNN he was impressed by how forward-looking the government is in preparing for the post-war period. Private and public sector investors are already deploying capital in the country, even though the end of the war may yet be some way off. Horizon Capital, a U.S. private equity firm, has won backing from a dozen major development finance institutions for its funds investing in Ukraine tech and export-oriented companies. Horizon's $254 million growth fund, which closed to initial contributions in April, was at the time the largest Ukraine-focused fund set up since Russia launched a full-scale invasion of its neighbor, according to the firm's CEO Lena Kostyany. More than 400 global companies pledged support Wednesday for rebuilding the war-torn economy at the Ukraine Recovery Conference in London. Citi, Sanofi, and Philips are among firms that have signed up to the Ukraine Business Compact, signaling their intent to boost investment in the country. The other contentious issue is whether Russian assets, particularly the estimated $300 billion of frozen Russian central bank reserves, should be used to fund the reconstruction of Ukraine. A bipartisan bill was introduced in the U.S. Senate this week advocating this move. The EU estimated in April that about $300 billion of assets belonging to Russia's central bank were frozen in G7 countries. Von der Leyen said the Commission would make a proposal on tapping these assets before the end of the summer. The Russian assets issue is the elephant in the room at the conference, said Philip D. Zelikow, a historian at the University of Virginia and Stanford University, who has written about Ukraine's long-term recovery. If we don't use Russian assets, we simply won't have enough money to do it. In Congress, bipartisan legislation has been submitted to allow the president to confiscate Russian state assets held in the United States and earmark them for Ukraine's reconstruction. In Britain, the government has similarly proposed a measure that would allow the frozen assets to be donated to rebuild Ukraine, and meanwhile maintain sanctions against Russia. German Development Minister Svenja Josi has told DW that Russia should one day be made to pay for the reconstruction of war-ravaged Ukraine. They have to pay for what they destroyed. That is the international law, she said. That they need to pay, that is obvious. They destroyed all the infrastructure, they destroyed the houses, and they need to pay for that. In Brussels, the jury is still out as the EU tries to reach consensus amid concerns by some countries about the legality of such a move, and the president, it may set, with leaders to discuss the matter at a summit next week. As the war in Ukraine and debate about how to fund the reconstruction of the country continues, the issue of Russian assets could become the next big battleground. Confiscating Russian funds is a dangerous proposition, no matter how strong the moral, political, and financial case. The assets themselves are protected under international law, and any legal challenge to seize them would be tied up in court for years. Even using the predicted earnings generated by those assets is risky, as it could expose the United States and Europe to sizable losses if markets tank. The broader risk is to the stability and prestige of the dollar and the euro, and the two largest international reserve currencies. Countries that park their assets in dollars or euros, including China, might reassess if they see those assets are subject to confiscation. That could shake the foundations of international finance. The European Central Bank and U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen are among those who have warned that seizing Russian assets could have grave consequences. However, the West is currently caught in a dilemma. They do not have many choices as their ability to mobilize funds for Ukraine's reconstruction is limited. Jacob von Kierkegaard, a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund, worries that the EU's plan is not ambitious enough, particularly if the EU decides that Ukraine will ultimately become a member of the European Union by the early 2030s. Obviously, this depends on what the war goes, but none of the estimates I've seen suggest that this is near enough for a full-blown, front-loaded recovery that would make Ukrainian EU membership in around 10 or 12 years feasible, he says. The sobering conclusion is that even if the war draws to an end soon, which is unlikely, Ukraine's long path to recovery will pose an ongoing challenge to the West. Yet promoting its success is also the surest way to show that Russia's neo-imperial land grab has failed. As Russia continues to destroy, we are here to help Ukraine rebuild, said Secretary of State Antony Blinken, noting that the package had bipartisan support in Congress. Recovery is about laying the foundation for Ukraine to thrive. The reconstruction of Ukraine is undoubtedly a necessary undertaking, and there are still numerous challenges ahead on this decade-long journey. And with that, our program comes to a close. Thank you for watching. Goodbye and see you again.